All right. I think there will be more people coming in, but I will start introducing you already. There's a lot to be said. I can really do justice to your amazing career. I've known Mia for I think 2 decades almost. To be
Almost 20
honest,
years. Yes.
yeah, that's
You
a
were
lot
my
of
first
time.
grad student.
Yeah. And actually, I said to my colleague today that it was the only class ever that I couldn't wait to go to because it was so exciting to listen to you, and your presentation were so amazing every time. And there was a competition for people to get in your class. I remember that. But I also want to say that in academic terms, not just teaching, I think you really are one of the brilliant minds of terrorism research, if not the brilliant mind, because you were always on the spot. There were various developments, things coming up, and not just that, but you had all the theories in your head, and you could just pull them out. Okay, this theory, this theory, this theory. And this combination is really unique because you have many people who are very much into policies and other people who are more in the ivory tower, but you managed to do both in some way. And just to give some examples for others who are listening, suicide terrorism, cutting edge, women and terrorism, children and terrorism, cutting edge. And now we have QAnon, where we basically, we're looking from Europe towards the US and we didn't really understand what is going on. And before you know it, you have QAnon here, you have QAnon Austria, by the way, as well. Also QAnon Germany and others. And this whole combination has become very interesting or perhaps even toxic because it is very much intertwined with the far right. And then you have the whole COVID phenomenon and the anti-vax movement, and then you have demonstrations, violence. So these are really new developments, and one can see that this is yet again something new going on, new types of radicalization, extremism, and that's why I thought for especially our Austrian public, and I guess also people from Germany, and I also want to welcome colleagues from the OEP, Cengiz and Eric and Christian. Yeah, so you're definitely the one person to enlighten us on these developments, to figure out what to do with them. And with this, I guess I give you the floor. We have a presentation, and then we'll have also a chance for discussion and questions. Um, can you share? You think should be possible, but if not, let me know.
I'm looking to share now. And we have a backup just in case anything happens. So worst comes to worst, we're good. All right. So first of all, let me just say good Nabend. And what a pleasure it is. Although I have to tell you, I wish I was in person in Vienna. As Danny knows, Vienna is one of my favorite places in the world, not just because of the coffee, because I love the coffee and this this dessert that they have, this Mozart inspired dessert, but also because of Gustav Klimt, which is my favorite artist. And so probably every time I've been to Vienna, Daniela takes me to the museum. So it's such an honor to be here with you today. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about QAnon and sort of this notion of the conspiracy theory and how it's becoming a global phenomenon, but also specifically how it impacts Europe. And so I have, again, we have it as a very American phenomenon, but when you unpack QAnon, which is what I did with Dr. Sofia Moskalenko in our book, what I get is a phenomenon that draws on a lot of European traditions of anti-Semitism and the far right. And so I'll bring out some of those in today's talk. So this is slightly different than what I would usually do because I want to emphasize sort of the European character and some of these linkages. And I always have to do this because I know who I am, but I always have to remember, because this research is funded by the Minerva Research Initiative, which is the Department of Defense, I have to tell you that I don't work for the Department of Defense and I don't represent the Department of Defense or the US government. And also that any mistakes I make are my own. So the work that I'm doing, which I'm happy to answer during the Q&A, that it can be anything about today's talk, or I work on gender-based violence. I look at the role of women. My next book is also building on Bombshell to look at women in the jihad. I'm also looking at sort of the role of social media and radicalization and recruitment, and then this insider threat notion. And this, again, very specific to America, but what happens with members of the military or members of law enforcement begin to be recruited either by the far right or by conspiracy groups? What happens now when sort of the source of law and order is now illegal and disorder and working towards a kind of chaos? And here are some of the books that Danny was kind enough to mention. Again, there's a theme, right? They all have almost all of them have the word terrorism in them, except for Pastels and Pedophiles. And I'll talk about whether or not QAnon is actually like a terrorist threat. Now, just in very brief, they like to say the bottom line up front. QAnon is a baseless conspiracy theory that makes an argument that Hollywood celebrities, the royal families around the world, like the Windsors and even the royal family in Holland, and mostly Democrats, are trafficking children and drinking their blood. So again, when I visited Danny once in Romania, we went to the Dracula castle. So it's like along the lines of like Dracula, drinking the blood in order to stay young or stay youthful, or sometimes maybe the blood is used as an ingredient in cooking. That former President Trump, who was again, twice impeached President Trump, who's no longer president, despite about 40% of Americans believing otherwise, apparently was going to fight this cabal, that the cabal has been in charge of politics forever, and they have been manipulating things, that he was going to bring justice and save the children, and that we actually see a correlation between QAnon engagement activity and the pandemic. And you can go so far as to say that had it not been for the pandemic, QAnon probably would still be a fringe movement dying out. But what ended up happening is that the pandemic sort of supercharged QAnon as a conspiracy, and as Dr. Pesoy mentioned, also encouraged other kinds of adjacent conspiracies, anti-vaccine, anti-mask, other kinds of conspiracies that may have pre-existed QAnon, like that the earth is flat, that the moon landing was faked, that there are lizard people that are disguised as humans. All of these basically came up again. And in many ways, QAnon becomes almost like an umbrella organization where they are incorporating some of these conspiracy theories that might have predated QAnon for 20 years. Now, it's important to know that a lot of the QAnon tropes are very much connected to the far right, as Dr. Pesoy mentioned. They are anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic. So what you see then, sorry, I'm allergic to myself. So what you see then is that some of these things that you're going to read about QAnon, or things that QAnon alleges, sound very familiar because they are age old. Now, part of what we see is that from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was the Tsarist secret police in 1902 and 1903, created this fictional document that argued that a Jewish cabal was meeting in the graveyard to plot and plan how to take over the media and the banking system of Europe. And of course, right away, everybody knew that it was a fake document, that it was false. Nevertheless, it got a lot of traction. It was translated in the United States and America by Henry Ford, the car maker. And so it's now, I think this book has been translated, or this pamphlet has been translated to 85 different languages. And it is still a bestseller, and it's still available, bookstores and Amazon, and, even walking through Cairo in Arabic on the street. But what QAnon does is it repurposes a lot of the themes that were in the protocols about this cabal of powerful individuals who were manipulating and pulling things, like the other thing that's important to understand is that in America, people who believe they control the banks, or they control Hollywood, or that they control anything, given that they're than 2% of the population also tend to subscribe to QAnon. And you see that there is a very good correlation between, based on the survey data, based on people who believe in QAnon and people who subscribe to these anti-Semitic beliefs. On the channels, what they will do is they will find pictures of world leaders around the world, Putin, a sculpture in, perhaps maybe have gone to or they've addressed the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli Parliament, or pictures of the skull cap in order to convey this idea that, you know, you see.
I don't know. I think it's the internet connection. Maybe it's
okay. Let me use my phone. I'll use my phone, and this way you won't have to worry. I have the backup on purpose. Okay, let's get to the hotspot. Are we good now?
Yeah, so far so good. Let's give it another try.
I apologize to everyone for the interruption. I will begin to share from where we started. Okay, so the idea is that taking these images out of context of all the world leaders, including Putin or you know, Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, even Rudy Giuliani, wearing the skull cap, is in order to convey that the Jews are controlling politics. Now, the other thing that they will say often is that the Jews are to blamed for what in America is called critical race theory. This argument, now again, critical race theory has been distorted in the United States to be everything, including teaching about slavery. What critical race theory actually is, it's about showing that the law treats white people and Black people differently. And it's really only taught in law schools. But what QAnon does, and it sort of is playing both sides of the issue of race, is that on the one hand, they blame the Jews for having had the slave trade, and also they blame the Jews for a critical race theory. Now, this argument that Jews control the media, what QAnon did was it repurposed some of this images and memes from the far right, where they took pictures of all of the news broadcasters and the anchor people, men and women, and they put like a Jewish star, a blue star, next to them to say, this one is Jewish, this one is Jewish, this one's married to a Jew. And they went through all of, you know, CNN and all of the major channels in America that the Jews, quote unquote, control the media. Now, this is something that existed before QAnon that was created by far right groups and anti-Semitic groups. But then they will even say on the far right, so Sinclair Media is even to the right of Fox News. And they will say that even Sinclair Media is controlled by the Jews. And so as far as the QAnon channels are concerned, they will say, do not listen to Fox News. Do not listen to even the American One News Network. Only get your news from us. And by doing this, by making individuals suspicious of all media, including media on the far right, they're creating an information bubble where it's what Mark Sageman calls an echo chamber, that people are never going to be getting any perspective other than the ones that they are spoon feeding their captured audience. And also, by having the information echo chamber, you never receive any information that is disconfirming. Now, their particular antipathy is for the Rothschild family. And so, again, this idea that the Rothschilds and then George Soros are really the money that is controlling everything in Europe, and that also that these evil billionaires have created COVID-19 in order to cause, sort of some sort of new world order. The argument is, on the one hand, they say that COVID-19 is intended to cut the population down. So it's like one of the themes from the Marvel universe, this idea that COVID-19 is going to be killing off a percentage of the population. Another argument is that COVID-19 is killing the older generation that, would understand what was really going on. And so there are all these conspiracy theories that argue not just about QAnon and child trafficking cabal, but also that the cabal has their fingers in any bad event that has happened, any disaster. They're responsible for 9/11. They're responsible for COVID. They're responsible for the financial crisis of 2008. In other words, anything bad that happens, it's because of the Jews. The other thing is, and I especially love this one, that the Jews are blamed for porn. And, the argument is that a lot of the early pornographers were Jews, or that maybe they, like Jeremy, well, I won't get into pornography stars, but that even stars of pornography were Jewish. And what was so interesting for me is that we look at QAnon channels as part of the project, not just in English. So we have a team that speaks a number of different languages, and we're doing the methodology that we did with ISIS when we were monitoring their Telegram, that we're looking to see, are they saying things in English differently than what they were saying in Arabic, differently than what they were saying in French or Turkish? What we're doing now with QAnon is very similarly, we have a number of foreign language QAnon channels in German, in Russian, in Arabic, in Hebrew, even in French, and we are doing this comparison. Now, of course, the Jews are blamed for the coronavirus, which fits in nicely with QAnon, because again, this idea that the Jews are controlling things. And you see, even from this was both on the QAnon channels and on the far right. You see it's the Trojan horse, but the head of the horse is the coronavirus with the spikes, which is what the Quran is. And then inside the Trojan horse is really, again, the same very negative image of the Jew that's controlling the world. The other thing that they will do is they will take an incident that is a real incident. So, for example, we're currently in the United States. There is a trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, who's Robert Maxwell's daughter. And they will say that Maxwell and Epstein, and even where Epstein got his money, Les Wexner, it's all Jews, and that the Jews are connected to Israel, and that ultimately Israel is at fault. And this gets interesting because on the one hand, they love President Trump, but on the other hand, they will constantly sort of mention that Trump may have been infiltrating the cabal in order to destroy it from within. And again, this becomes very relevant because although the vast majority of all of the QAnon predictions never came true, the one time they were correct is when they talked about how Bill Gates and his wife were splitting up and getting a divorce, and it was because of Epstein. And that turned out to actually be accurate. And so it's like, the argument that Maggie Thatcher used to make about terrorism and counterterrorism. For counterterrorism, we have to be right every single time, and they only have to be right once. And in QAnon, it's some of the same thing, is that with a conspiracy theory, you can be wrong 4,000 times, but if you're right one time or accurate one time, then you're able to tell your constituency and the people consuming your material, you see, we were right all along. Ignore those other 4,000 times. Now, building on these racist tropes, one of the things that combines QAnon is not just hatred of Jews, but also hatred of people of color. And a very, this something that came up in the aftermath of slavery during Reconstruction in the United States. There was a period of time where this is where the rise of the KKK, which previously, started with people who were tracking down runaway slaves and then transitioned into this horrible organization. This idea that Black and brown men were coming for your women, especially your girl children. And you see this a little bit also in Europe, where this idea of like the dark Turkish men, that they have these gangs of marauding Turks or Muslims, especially on like at Christmas markets or on New Year's Eve, that they are, looking for white women. This plays on some of the most basic tropes that we've seen in racist groups on the far right. And what's again particularly surprising is that you're seeing this not just on the English QAnon channels, but also on the QAnon channels that are in Hebrew, which to me is very absurd that, the Hebrew QAnon channels that are really targeting only Hebrew speakers, so Jewish people, are using these anti-Semitic and racist tropes. And we also see that they even use the blood libel. Now, the blood libel, just to explain, comes from the end of the 12th, 13th century. The argument was that Jews were taking the blood of unbaptized babies to make their unleavened bread during Passover, what we call matzah. Now, it's interesting in part because if you know anything about Jewish dietary laws, they do everything to remove blood, like to the point that when you make meat kosher, you alternate between putting it in salt and putting it in water 3 different times in order for all of the blood to be gone. And so the idea that they would actually use blood is really the opposite. But again, it didn't matter because this was very popular, especially in the Catholic Church, but even became part of the Reformation. And so this is something that cross-cuts all of the different sort of historic anti-Semitism coming from Christianity. And you see that this is in Hebrew, that again, it's talking about blood and this idea of vampirism, that in order to maintain their youth and their health, that the cabal is drinking the blood of children. Now, to give you a sense of what a Q drop looks like, again, it's this very vague, it was on 4chan, then 8chan, and then 8chan became 8kun. So really the underbelly of the internet. And it was these vague little, they called them Q drops. It was almost like a puzzle that you had to solve. And then you had a number of people who are either influencers on YouTube or making money from this, translating what the Q drops meant. And so, from the very beginning, it became clear to me that if you followed the money, you would get a really interesting insight into who was really behind QAnon, because you would see who was benefiting. Now, what we see, as I mentioned earlier, is that QAnon support and interest and popularity was relatively flat from October 2017, when it starts, until around the pandemic in March 19th, March 19th, 2020, you see a massive uptick. And this is with growth in QAnon accounts, the ones that are decoding, the ones that I mentioned that are explaining to you, here's the Q drop, and here's a tweet from Trump, or here's a Q drop, and here's a video of his interview, and what matches with what and what it means, but also with the Instagram account. So across many platforms, we see a massive uptick in QAnon. According to the American Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative newspaper, the increase was about 600% as a result of the pandemic. And interestingly, it was only in 2020, finally, that the social media companies in Silicon Valley really took action. Now, interestingly enough, Reddit, which is where, again, you had subreddits, closed QAnon accounts very early in 2018, 2 years before you saw most of the companies in California doing something. So Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And you saw in the summer of 2020, the first series of removals from Twitter, from Facebook, even from Etsy, that they were removing the QAnon content, and that by October 2020, a month before the US election, there was another removal. Now, what QAnon did, and again, having had experience watching ISIS use the simulation and hide from the artificial intelligence, the AI tools that social media uses, you saw QAnon do the same thing. So ISIS, instead of calling itself ISIS, would be 1515. So it looks like ISIS, but it doesn't say ISIS. What QAnon did was the same thing. They would say, don't say QAnon, use 17 anon, because Q is the 17th letter, or misspell Q, like CUE anon. And these were all of the different tactics that we saw jihadi groups use to evade when they were being deplatformed in December 2016. The other thing that QAnon uses, and they encourage their users also to use these codes. So this is where you get this Pizzagate, which technically predates QAnon, but Pizzagate, because pizza had to do with these pedophile codes about sexually abusing young girls. And all of the different words that, again, during the pandemic, many of us were cooking at home, and I was posting pictures of pizza, again, not realizing that, of course, QAnon would have thought that all of my pictures of pizza were about pedophilia. But, each of these codes matches up with a particular kind of child that they are sexually abusing. Now, starting as early as 2019, the head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, he's still the head of the FBI, said that there was a possibility that QAnon could have some potential for terrorism. But the question is QAnon really a terrorist group? Now, unlike ISIS or Al-Qaeda, there isn't a structure to QAnon. So we don't have, even like when you have this a non-hierarchical structure, there's no structure whatsoever. There's also no shared intentions. So in other words, everyone who believes in QAnon doesn't have the same sort of series of intents that they are going to pursue. There's also this notion of an a la carte ideology. If you are a jihadi Salafi, you read the same books, you subscribe to the ideology and milestones, you understand what is fitna, which is sort of the civil war in Islam, you understand who is with us and who is against us. But what happens in QAnon is that it has become in many ways an umbrella organization to all the other conspiracies. And so Anna Merlan calls it a conspiracy singularity. In other words, all the conspiracies sort of align at the same time. Now, what it means is that people who believe in QAnon, some may believe that the moon landing was fake, or that 9/11 was an inside job, or that there's lizard people, but they don't all believe the same thing. Also, we have some data in the United States that have done surveys, and these surveys are consistent over time in terms of something like 15 to 17% of American adults surveyed believe in QAnon. And we don't, they don't ask the question, you believe in QAnon? Because remember, they're told not to say Q anymore, but they'll ask the question, do you believe that there's a blood drinking cabal that is trafficking in children? And something like 15 to 17% of those surveyed said yes. This would represent, if it's a representative sample, would be 30 million adults in America. That would be the biggest terrorism group in the history of terrorism groups. So it's so numerous, it cannot be covert. Now, here is some of the data that American Enterprises Institute published in the Washington Post. This was at the end of January of 2021. And you see that 15% roughly of the people surveyed, 29% identify as conservative Republicans, but 6% identified as liberal or Democrat. And so this is where it's very surprising. Despite the very important role that President Trump plays in this conspiracy, there are still people who identified, let's say they were a supporter in the United States of Bernie Sanders, they see themselves as Democrats, and they believe that Donald Trump has been secretly fighting a group of child sex traffickers that include prominent Democrats and Hollywood elites. What we do know is that starting a year later, in October 2018, QAnon started showing up at former President Trump's rallies with a sign or wearing the outfit. They would wear Q on their chest, or they would hold a sign. And so in many ways, Dr. Moskalenko argues that QAnon has become more of a mass movement than it is a terrorist group. But when you look at what happened in the summer right before the elections, this was, as QAnon was being deplatformed, we have these primary elections to see who is going to run in the following November. And there were 97 different candidates that believed in QAnon. And these were the states that had the most candidates: Florida, Texas, and California. Now, of those 97, 24 were successful, and they were in the November elections 2-1. And this is one of the reasons why the Republican Party in the United States has become so sort of intricately involved with QAnon, and they are unwilling to disavow the sort of antics, if you will, outrageous statements, the Islamophobic, racist, and anti-Semitic statements that both Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert make, despite the fact that there's currently now an attempt that we've removed Marjorie Taylor Greene from all of her committee assignments. There's an attempt to do the same thing now to Lauren Boebert because of these offensive things that she said about Ilhan Omar, who is a Muslim representative in Congress. Now, I think a lot of people look at January 6th, which we're going to be coming soon on the 1-year anniversary, and think that QAnon was responsible. And I think part of this confusion is because QAnon was so visibly obvious during the failed insurrection. First of all, you saw Jacob Chansley, this guy here is known as the QAnon shaman. He's in jail with the horns and the face paint and the bare chest and, you know, the body tattoos. And, you know, he's pretty easy to pick out of a crowd. And so in addition to him, you also had other people that were, like, for example, Douglas Jensen, who's also in jail now, wearing a big Q on their chest. And the argument is that QAnon really bulked out the crowd, but that for the most part, the QAnon supporters were not the most dangerous at the Capitol in January. Oops, sorry. What you have instead is you have an overlap or intersectionality between QAnon and many of the right-wing groups. So in America, we have these anti-government militias, Patriot Front, which just recently marched at the Lincoln Memorial, you know, with their khakis and their polo shirts, or Proud Boys, or Oath Keepers, or Three Percenters. In other words, many of these anti-government militias also have a lot of QAnon believers in them. So there's an overlap. But we also saw, like with the conspiracies, that the people who believe in QAnon tend to also believe in these other conspiracies. And so they're anti-5G, or they're anti-mask, or they're anti-vaccine. And so what we're seeing is that it's very hard to tease out what element is what, like what is uniquely QAnon, what is uniquely far right, and what is the intersection of the two. And Mr. Chansley, this QAnon shaman, is the perfect example because, again, he's very well known for being QAnon. He would show up in Arizona also, like no matter what the weather is, no shirt, with the horns and the face paint. But you see that from his body tattoos, these are images from Norse mythology that tend to be associated with the far right. So he's the perfect example of someone that is both far right, believing in sort of the white extremist nationalist ideology, as well as QAnon. But also we saw that a lot of people in the US military have started to believe in QAnon. And this is the other project that I'm doing with Ari Perliger and Sofia Moskalenko, is to try to figure out what is the situation in the US military, partly because on July 4th, which is American Independence in 2020, Michael Flynn, who's a former lieutenant general who's been also disgraced and arrested and then pardoned by President Trump, did the video where he pledged his allegiance to QAnon. And, you know, we've seen this before. We've seen this with different affiliated terrorist groups, jihadi groups around the world, pledging allegiance to ISIS. Well, he pledged allegiance to QAnon. And so we're looking at this insider threat, you know, to what extent is QAnon recruiting or infiltrating both in law enforcement and into the US military, because this becomes salient not just for the United States, but also as American troops are sent around the world, are they also going to be bringing with them this message of QAnon? And Dr. Moskalenko produced an article, you know, a few months ago, arguing that the most dangerous elements at the Capitol were these far-right militia groups. And we know that also approximately 20% of those arrested at the Capitol. So again, we only have from the people arrested, not the people who participated. There's almost 700 people who've been arrested, that you're looking at about 20% are either current or former military, but also many of these military have been accused of being part of the far right. And so it's one of the reasons why the US military is very concerned about QAnon. And START, which is at the University of Maryland, Michael Jensen's research shows the overlap between male and female people who were arrested prior to January 6th and those arrested on January 6th. And one of the things that's interesting, again, for me, because I work on women in terrorism, is the important and crucial role that women have played in QAnon and women in the military. So, for example, this woman here, Emily Rainey, who was in charge of psychological operations and intelligence, had to resign her commission at Fort Bragg because she was arrested at the Capitol, but also she was on videos on YouTube and other platforms promoting QAnon theories. The first person also killed at the Capitol, this woman, Ashley Babbitt, was also a military veteran of 4 tours of Afghanistan. And so again, we see that women and also women in the military have played an important role. Ashley Babbitt has now become a martyr for QAnon. And as Dr. Pesoy said, QAnon has gone European. We've seen more and more QAnon groups in Europe. We saw, for example, in the summer of 2020, 10 different rallies in the United Kingdom, in London, in Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham, that they were, again, bringing back this idea of Pizzagate that, you know, again, has been disproven in the United States, but also you see some of the same arguments, recognize the symbology about pizza and walnuts and all the cheese and all of the different code words. According to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, you see that the US is always the #1 QAnon sort of promoting country on social media. But when you start looking at #2, you get Canada, UK, and then you get Australia, and now you're getting Germany and Indonesia and Russia. And so what is also very interesting is that although Russia and Russian bots and Russian accounts helped promote QAnon originally in October 2017, now the 2 countries, the malign foreign actors that were promoting QAnon, Russia and China, also have a QAnon problem. And the spread of QAnon, as you see, Europe is really in trouble as far as the spread of QAnon. And we're trying to figure out, and this is something I'm doing with Dr. Nelly Lahoud, who's on the team, why does it seem that the Arab world is almost inoculated from QAnon? What you see instead in the Arab world is a lot of anti-vaccine and COVID denialism, but you're not seeing as much conspiracy theories about child trafficking, despite the fact that I mentioned the protocols were translated into Arabic. It's a very popular book. A lot of conspiracies, they call them mu'amarat. A lot of conspiracy theories are very popular. And yet, when you look at the map of the Arab world, you're not having a lot of QAnon activity compared to Europe or compared to Latin and South America. Now, I just want to very briefly talk about what Sophia means when she talks about unfreezing and what's the psychological process, because we're not talking about radicalization, but we're talking about unfreezing of social domains. Now, what this means is that most people have very strongly held opinions either about science or religion or gender. For example, that people will have argued of previous generations, it's very clear there's 2 genders, male and female. But now we're having different conversations about trans people or about non-binary or about androgynous people. And so when your very core values are being questioned or challenged, one of the things that you see is that people have anger and disgust. And they might get very upset about it. And so what ends up happening is that there is a reaction to QAnon. As a result, when you have the mass unfreezing, you see all of the different conspiracy theories that are part of QAnon that, you know, include everything from lizard people and Jewish space lasers, or that there is a pedophile cabal. And that this then leads, because people are participating in conspiracy theories, it leads people to feeling good, like they have a feeling of belonging, and that they feel that now they have a community. And, you know, Dr. Pesoy has talked about this in her own work about the push and pull factors. This corresponds, the push factors being these unfrozen social domains, but the pull factors being the utilities that people benefit from participating. Now, one of the things that we argue in the book is if you have someone in your family or among your friend network, and if we're talking about millions of people, it's very conceivable that someone you know believes in QAnon, that arguing with them is really the wrong way to go about it. You're not going to argue them out of their belief system. So instead, we talk about sort of engaging them positively. And again, these are the lessons we learn from work that has been done by Institute for Strategic Dialogue and Moonshot CVE, that, you start with, yes, I understand that you're upset, or yes, child trafficking is a serious problem, or yes, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein are disgusting. Like, in other words, you start from a position where you're agreeing, but then you move to sort of argue about some of the details in QAnon just don't make sense. Like with most conspiracy theories, that they're inconsistent, that you have opposing, information at the same time. And one of the things, for example, is this notion of where we go one, we go all. This is this WWG1W, in other words, this is the hash that they use. This is what they're saying all the time. This is part of that pledge to QAnon. And when you would ask people, for example, QAnon influencers in Europe, where it comes from, they would say it is on the bell, inscribed on the bell on John F. Kennedy Jr.'s, John F. Kennedy, the former president that was killed, on his boat. And so I can find a bell. Like, in other words, I can't convince you I'm not drinking blood, but I can definitely look for a bell. And so we looked for the bell. There was no bell. And it's not like we need Nicolas Cage to find the bell. The bell wasn't stolen. We contacted both the Kennedy family, the Kennedy archives, and we went to the boat. No bell. And we did a reverse image search. And what we found is that this is from a movie from 1996 called White Squall. And it's about, a group of high school students that are sailing, like a semester at sea. And they're running around saying, where we go one, we go all. And there's a bell on the boat. It's all fictional. And in fact, I worked with the LA Times this week. We published an article on the extent of which how much of QAnon mythology is stolen from Hollywood playbooks, like from their scripts and from movies and from novels. And so the irony, of course, is that for a group that calls Hollywood Pedowood, that, remember, it's a Hollywood elite that are controlling the cabal, so many of the story and the plots in QAnon are stolen from films. So I'm going to stop here, say about the fact that it is, in many respects, it's a mental emergency, and that the way to deal with QAnon might be through psychological treatment, either through building immunity and teaching social media literacy, or also offering different kinds of therapy. And say thank you very much, because I want to leave time for the chat and for the questions. Thank you so much for your time and your generosity this morning. And I look forward to answering your questions, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Mia. That was really a tour de force from the origins to various types of manifestations, and ending up also in Europe. And also the question, I think, which is very important: what is the difference between this phenomenon and other phenomena that we know, and how do we need to adapt our strategies to address them? I don't have specific data on QAnon in Austria, but I know in a more general sense that, for example, we have a hotline where people can call in issues related to radicalization, and from our partners there, we know that now, for example, the jihadi phenomenon is not really relevant, or not that relevant anymore. Other kinds of people call about other kinds of phenomena, and this is, of course, very much related to conspiracy theories, but also you have other ages. So, with the classical extremist types, you would have younger people who radicalize. Now you tend to have older people who radicalize. So you have the kids asking for advice how to deal with the parents, which is a completely new situation. I just wanted to mention two things which I think are really, really important. And this idea of how they manage to recycle basically old ideas and integrate them and create this new picture, but also how it's really intertangled with pop culture and fiction. And I don't know if this is really new, or we can also see in other areas, but we haven't really noticed it before. But anyway, something to look into maybe in the next project. But I will start with the questions because we have some questions. I also have, but I will give priority to the public because I can ask you later. So first, there seems to be an inconsistency. One participant, I think it's Vanna, hello Vanna, said looking at the map, wasn't Indonesia mentioned as number 5 of countries with QAnon? On the map, it's not colored.
Well, then that's a mistake that we made. We were using a program that Sophia used as it's a map that populates. So I'm going to fix that. Thank you very much for for pointing that out. We also noticed that the program didn't color Venezuela. So like I put in the red for Venezuela, but thank you for catching that. I also wanted to mention that, this issue of democratic countries, there's an argument in Robert Pape's book about suicide terrorism that it's more effective towards democracies than it is for non-democracies. And when you look at the map, actually, we see both democratic countries and non-democratic countries. The difference, of course, is in an authoritarian regime, you can control the media or access to the media, and you can shut down the internet like China does. And so I think that there's two elements to it. One, we might not know the extent of QAnon penetration into an authoritarian regime because they don't have a free media that would be reporting on it. But two, the authoritarian regimes have tools at their disposal that democracies choose not to exercise, that allows them to control information or control access to the information. The third element might be in places like Hungary, where we do see QAnon activity, that it could be that the authoritarian regime finds the conspiracy to be creating what we call useful idiots, that it's a way of controlling the population so that there's so many different dynamics at work, either that we won't know the extent of QAnon in authoritarian regimes, or that the authoritarian regimes might be better at clamping down. What we've done in Arabic is that we have gone through Telegram and TikTok and Facebook in Arabic, looking for the same things that Institute for Strategic Dialogue did for QAnon, and we're not finding it in Arabic. In fact, one of the things that Dr. Lahoud found, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, Nellie Lahoud is sort of an expert on jihadism, and she has a book coming out where she went through all the Abbottabad documents in Arabic, not in translation. And she really dispels many of the myths that we had about Osama bin Laden. But, we're looking, and what she found, which was fascinating, is that the anti-COVID, that COVID deniers in Arabic are citing research that's being done in Israel. And this is, again, very surprising. They're not saying like Al-Uda Sahyuni, which is ordinarily the way Israel is referred to in the Arabic press, is the Zionist entity or the Zionist enemy. They're saying Israel, which is just, one of these things where with the right wing as well, I think QAnon is creating very strange bedfellows.
And there was actually a question on this, which was partly answered. There is a second part to it. Did Trump trigger some of the reactions of people in both the US and Europe so that they joined QAnon? So what's the role of Trump, I guess, in this? And also from the same person, if we offer therapy, would people not think this to be also a conspiracy?
I mean, first of all, Carmen, that's a fantastic question. One of the things that, when we applied for this Minerva grant, and we were very lucky to get it, to get a grant during a pandemic is just, it's a gift. They said, do you want to do focus groups? And I said, but you realize if you're bringing in people who believe in conspiracy theories, they're going to think we're part of the conspiracy. So the research that Sophia has done argues, instead of doing, let's say, the traditional cognitive therapy, there's something called MBSR, which is more sort of, they don't call it therapy, it's mindfulness training, it's meditation, and it's a different kind of therapy, which is a lot less invasive to the individual. Like, you don't have to, like, for example, if you belong to Alcoholics Anonymous in Canada or US, you have to stand up and say, hi, my name is Mia, I'm an alcoholic. You have to admit to doing something. MBSR, the mindfulness training, does not require this at all. But it's true. The reason why Sophia broke down QAnon into 3 different categories is we know from people who've been involved in terrorism, for example, in the far right, when you start having doubts, that's when you need sort of the off ramp to get you out of the group. Because when you're having doubts, your behavior may not match up to the doubts. In fact, according to Christian Picciolini, when he was a neo-Nazi, when he had the doubts, he got more tattoos and he beat up more people of color. In other words, if you just look at the behavior, the person looks like they're more radicalized. So this is why you need different kinds of treatment or different kinds of approaches for the degree of belief or QAnonness. So if someone is a doubter, help them get out. If someone is a former, help them stay out. But we also have to, adjust our expectations. We're not going to be able to totally get rid of QAnon in the same way that we've never been able to totally get rid of terrorism. Even when you have a very successful case of counterterrorism, or that the terrorists themselves decide to lay down their arms and participate in a peace agreement, like in Northern Ireland, you're still going to have offshoot groups or splinter factions that continue to fight. We suspect that there will be a core of individuals who believe in QAnon no matter what. And the issue of Donald Trump is relevant because so much of QAnon sort of placed Donald Trump on this pedestal that it's very hard to separate support for Trump and support for QAnon. Trump himself is never going to disavow it. And so we end up having this very strange cognitive dissonance of people who will, till their dying breath, believe that the American election was stolen, that President Biden is not actually president, and that's Donald Trump in a mask, or that this blood drinking cabal is going to continue to control things.
Next question. If there's no hierarchy in QAnon, how does it work? How is it financed? Like a franchise umbrella for all the different protest movements?
So one of the things that we noticed was, as I mentioned, to follow the money, that there were individuals in QAnon who were profiting like in the millions. So Sidney Powell, who is the lawyer for Flynn, who, is having now, there's fights within QAnon of these influential individuals. Lynn Wood, who's another lawyer, is attacking Sidney Powell, who's a lawyer, and attacking General Flynn, attacking Steve Bannon. What we're seeing is sort of the self-cannibalization. But these individuals were QAnon influencers. The argument we make in the book is that there probably wasn't one person posting as QAnon, that it was different people over time. And the joke that Sophia and I made is that, we figured this out from our couches during pandemic. We didn't fly around the world like the HBO documentary. Like we were able to figure out, because the writing style is different. And so people that are doing sentiment analysis or other kinds of NLP, natural language processing analysis of the Q drops see changes over time. So it's very likely that it was a different person at a different time. But this is why it's more like almost like a mass hysteria movement, more so than a hierarchical structure. Now, people initially, when they did these documentaries, probably thought that if they found out who QAnon was, it would undermine the popularity. But most people now in QAnon don't care who QAnon was, whether it was Jim or Ron Watkins, his son, who are the former owners of 8chan, 8kun, or whether it might be Flynn, or whether it might have been what they call a LARP, a live action role play, that it started out as like a joke and it got a life of its own.
We have also a longer comment. I'm just going to select the gist of it. So the question refers really to the recruitees. So do we actually have a type that joins QAnon? Are we talking about people who are uneducated, dissatisfied, unemployed, or people who are easily manipulated, or people who don't belong, they have the feeling they don't belong, and they get this kind of enhanced status and feeling of belonging by joining? And to add on to that, is there also an effect of the economic crisis, or maybe the corona crisis as well, to kind of exacerbate this kind of situations?
So apparently I was in a German documentary last week, and I talked about the fact that, we had the perfect storm in March of 2020, where we had a global health crisis with the pandemic. We had an economic crisis, and we had a social justice crisis with the killing of George Floyd. in the spring and summer, where we had both the killing of George Floyd, the videotaping of it, and then all the marching. And the marching actually was global. There was a global justice crisis around the world. And I think that that combination made a lot of people more vulnerable. Now, I skipped through this because I wanted to get through the questions, but what we saw in the United States, at least we have data for the US, where ordinarily it's about 1 in 10 people who suffer from anxiety and who have some sort of mental health issues. During the pandemic, that increased 400% to 4 in 10. And when you look at the people who've been arrested associated with January 6th, Pyrrhus data, Michael Jensen's data says that 68% of those people have a history of mental illness. So I think it's important that I think all of us were suffering during the pandemic, and that the pandemic created a vulnerability in most people. When you look at the demographics of QAnon, you have people who are educated. There was one woman, she had a master's degree from Harvard University, which is considered the best university in the United States. People with money, people who are wealthy. Melissa Rain Lively in Arizona was a very wealthy woman, had a very successful business. She lost her business as a result of going crazy in a shop, a Target shop, where she destroyed a mask display because it was all part of the cabal. So there isn't a specific type of individual. I think that it means that everyone potentially is vulnerable. But we do know from people who join radical movements or people who are more susceptible that these are people who very often experience anxiety. With school shooters and lone actor shooters, they might be people who've been bullied. So there is something there that people are more vulnerable. But I think what happens is if you believe in one conspiracy, you're more likely to believe in several others. But we don't have it's not like what we saw, Peter Nesser's breaking down of jihadis showed that there were different kinds of people who joined who were recruiters and different people who took action. So you had within ISIS, everyone from people getting out of jail, converts who didn't know anything about Islam, to, very wealthy individuals with a better than high levels of education, like Engineers for Jihad that Diego Gambetta talks about. So like with most movements, there is no one profile.
So there are more roles, basically.
There's roles within the movement, let's say for jihadi groups. Within QAnon, I think the vast majority of people in QAnon, they are participating on the social media. They might even show up in real life to a demonstration, but very few of them are actually moving from radical ideas to radical action. And I think that that's part of the problem with the radicalization literature, is that it's a black box between having a radical idea and carrying out a radical deed. We don't explain what that movement looks like. And the problem with a lot of the ideology and the theories of radicalization is it assumes a linearity, that one leads to the next. And you see, for example, a pyramid argument or an escalator or an elevator. Like they always assume that you get more and more involved and that there's a tipping point at which involvement now is guaranteed and you can't do anything about it. And I disagree with that. And one of my arguments against it is that, we can't really take out agency from any radical movement. With QAnon, the very few number, very small percentage, what Sophia would call a low base rate of people go from a radical idea to radical deeds. And, that's good, because if there's 30 million people with the radical thought, we don't want a significant portion of the 30 million actually carrying out violence.
Did you guys also find examples of individuals becoming violent who are not in that sense that radicalized? So could you say that, it can also happen that the violence intervenes a bit earlier, as it were, in the process?
One of the things you find with terrorism groups is that sometimes people acquire the ideology after they've joined. And so that it's not that you become radicalized and then you get involved. We haven't found cases yet. And part of it is that the number of people who are arrested is still, let's say if it's 30 million representative that believed in the blood drinking cabal, and there's 700 people arrested. And of those 700 people, maybe 70, 75 were QAnon, we're still dealing with a very, very small percentage of the whole. And I think that when we're looking at far right actors, anti-government actors, Oath Keepers, Patriot Front, KKK, those have a much higher percentage of radical thought to radical action than you are when you're looking at conspiracy theories. And part of it might be with the absence of a hierarchy that, you know, some people feel like their role is just to post or to disseminate or to like proselytize. Let me tell you how it's really going on. And this is one of the things that we see with conspiracy theories, that the moment you become convinced in a conspiracy theory, then you feel like almost a religious zeal to convert everyone around you. And, you know, people don't shut up about it. And so this is where, you know, again, we haven't seen the successful cross-pollination. So for example, people who weren't already right-wing believing in QAnon have had a very hard time, these groups, recruiting. So I saw in the summer of 2020, the incel, the involuntary celibate groups were separate. The right-wing Boogaloo movement was trying to recruit them. That wasn't very successful, in part because they didn't think that they could even, you know, pick up a gun or carry the weight of a gun because they have a very negative image. We also saw that some of the right-wing groups are hoping to recruit QAnon, and that's where Merrick Garland and the head of Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, is worried that these right-wing groups are going to start recruiting QAnon. So we don't want to say in the future we won't see it. We just haven't seen it up until now.
Mm-hmm. This is a great bridge to the next question, which is actually inquiring into connections between QAnon and identitarians, which are, I mean, I guess in the US you'd call them alt-right, we call them here new right. So have you encountered any connections between the two?
We are seeing a certain intersectionality that because there's so many common frames of reference, like the Jews controlling the media or a cabal controlling, or, you know, drinking blood, that a lot of people on the right are, like, as I showed you in that early slide, people who believe in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which would be alt-right or new right, also tend to have a higher disproportionate belief in QAnon. But we haven't seen as much like, for example, with the Patriot Front march this week in Washington, D.C., nobody showed up with a Q sign. So that, you know, you haven't seen Proud Boys demonstrating with QAnon materials. So I haven't seen as much, but part of it might be we're at a point where we're at an inflection point where the QAnon influencers are attacking each other. And this might be the best thing possible, that people will start, because remember, why do people leave movements? Is that there's a disconnect between expectations of involvement and the reality. When you start seeing the different leaders attacking each other, that might instigate your doubt or belief system in the movement. And that might be a good time to off-ramp these individuals. But I haven't seen as much right-wing recruitment yet. It doesn't mean we won't in the future. And it doesn't mean that if, let's say, Omicron, or I'm learning my Greek alphabet just from all of the different versions of COVID, but it doesn't mean that some more serious version of COVID in the future might not also reinvigorate QAnon, like March 19th, 2020 did previously.
Mm-hmm. And again, something on recruitment, but more concerning the diversity of people joining. So it says, isn't this umbrella function a result of the QAnon distribution via social media? Typical social media style, shallow common ground for people who actually are very diverse, same as for the anti-vaxxer movement in Austria and Germany.
So this is something, you know, and we know that, for example, Bruce Hoffman's work on Al-Qaeda talked about Al-Qaeda as like a franchise operation, that at the height of Al-Qaeda, so I'm going back a number of years, you know, you might have a group that, or an individual that says, oh, you know, I want to attack the United States, and bin Laden would send them $10,000 or $15,000, go for it. You know, here's some seed money, some startup cash. It's very possible that QAnon has this umbrella function, which is one of the reasons it was so popular, not so much because it's social media mediated, but because previously these groups did not communicate with each other. So people who believed that the moon landing was fake didn't really talk to the lizard people, and the lizard people didn't talk to the 9/11 was an inside job people. And so what QAnon did was it created a space, a safe space in social media and online where all of these groups could come together. And because you could cherry pick how much of what you believed, it allowed people with very different ideologies to feel part of a larger community. And I think it's that feeling, that shared feeling of belonging, that helps fuse these groups and create those pull factors that I talked about. But in general, the anti-vaxxers existed before QAnon. You know, they were anti-vaccine prior, but there's been this new invigoration that people who have been vaccinated, let's say in the US military, for 20 different things for years and years, all of a sudden now COVID-19, they're not going to get the vaccine. So this is where it's sort of the expression that we've heard before is old wine, new bottles, that this is very much a unique situation in which groups that previously had no affiliation are coming together under this QAnon sort of safety net or this safe space for them, and that they don't have to believe in everything. Now, there are arguments that, for example, we've seen to combat conspiracy theory, that one of the ways you do so is you get to the limit of someone's belief system and then you work backwards. So let's say, for instance, you believe in all of this stuff, but you don't believe in lizard people. The conversation starts with, okay, let's talk about chemtrails and lizard people and move backwards. But there's so many different conspiracies across the left and the right that, you know, it has a sort of feel that we call it, you know, throwing the pasta on the wall and what sticks. There's so many different narratives that allow people to feel part of this larger community. And with participation in a larger community, they do have all of these benefits of feeling of belonging.
We move in the area of prevention now with the next question. How should governments interact with QAnon? Should they be included in dialogue? How should one interact with them on social media, as facts and truths don't seem to matter? Should governments acknowledge the existence of this threat more, especially here in Europe and Austria in particular?
I think the governments definitely need to identify and acknowledge that there is a growing conspiracy movement that challenges the veracity of media reporting, that is anti-science, that is going to also generally, one of the things I noticed, and I put this in the book, is QAnon in France and Germany is also very anti-immigrant and Islamophobic. But of course, QAnon in Iraq is not Islamophobic, because there are a few places in the Middle East where you have QAnon. And so it's important that in France, in Germany, and Austria, that there's an acknowledgement that the growing anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment is also connected to anti-vaccine. This idea that the immigrants are bringing disease, that they are the reason that that COVID has spread. In the United States, it's also led to a lot of anti-Asian racism, where, you know, President Trump exacerbated that by blaming Asian individuals or China and using very racist terminologies even to describe COVID-19. As far as engaging them, some of the work that Moonshot CVE has done, this is Ross Burnett and Vidya Ramalingam, have shown that if you have these off ramps where you have either, you can divert people, so they have this mechanism where working with Google, when someone asks a question to Google, the algorithms will shift to a different kind of answer. What they're finding is that if you start with empathy, you are actually going to be much more successful with people who believe in conspiracy theories. So you start, so for example, you know, I've had occasion, especially during holidays, now that we're vaccinated, people have started getting together for meals. And you're sitting with people who have different politics than you. And you start from the, well, I appreciate what you're saying, and I see what you're saying, and I'm going to agree with you on this, but I'm going to disagree with you here, and this is why. And so what you're doing is you're not saying you're an idiot and you're crazy and you're stupid. Like, these are going to be absolutely not successful, guaranteed not successful. But what you start is you start from a position of, do you have any shared values that you can build on? And then from there, start to very slowly chip away at the belief in conspiracy, or at least expose people to improved social media literacy, so that they're getting their information from different sources. Because we know a frontal attack people will, because of confirmation bias, they will double and triple down. They will absolutely disagree with you. And in fact, they'll be more resistant to an argument that you're making that is a countervailing argument. So the way that you have to do this is very often sort of in a softer approach. And it's not quite with the right wing where Christian Picciolini used to say, hug a Nazi. Again, I'm not sure for certain people, if they're at the height of their belief system, if a hug is going to help. But one of the common themes we know for people who have left the neo-Nazi movement and the new right or alt-right has been empathy and understanding. So we assume that this will work also with the conspiracy people.
And do you think it makes sense to engage them online? This kind of online prevention or online social work, or it's
we haven't seen a lot of the, so there is some new research on whether people can be inoculated from conspiracy theories, but generally one of the ways that people have left conspiracy theories is that they get to a point themselves where they have the doubts, and the online space provides the off-ramp. Whereas it's not about CVE online. We saw, for example, with ISIS, that there was even a de-ISIS unit in the State Department, a defeat ISIS, and that their commercials did not work. And in fact, ISIS even made fun of some of the advertising campaigns that emerged to combat ISIS. But that is much more successful when it comes from within communities. And so there is a role, for example, for formers, but we also have to realize that, there's only a handful of formers in any space, and that they may or may not have credibility, because the moment that they leave, they now are part of the conspiracy, as someone in the question asked. If you're fighting the conspiracy, wouldn't they believe you're part of the conspiracy? And absolutely. And so this is where it's very tricky. And this wasn't, you didn't snap your fingers and all of a sudden believe that there is a blood drinking cabal. Most people started from what we would consider to be a logical and sensical position. For example, save the children. Child trafficking is a problem. There is a problem but here's where it gets interesting. The child trafficking, where the problem is usually in the global South. We see a lot of trafficking from Southeast Asia or from Africa or from, poorer countries in Latin America. When you look at child trafficking on QAnon, it's all white children. And so this is where, you can say, well, child trafficking is a problem, but it's not white children. And, here's all the data, and they can even go to specific individuals to say, listen, here are the fighting child trafficking, and the arrests that were made in Haiti or in Latin America. These are Black and brown children. So that might be a way to start to chip away at some of the foundational myths. The other way, like I said, it's a slow process. And most people have to come to the realization themselves that things aren't making sense, or that, wait a second, I'm starting to have doubts. What can I do? Because as they're having doubts, they may feel like they'll lose too much of their community belonging if they leave. So we need to create new communities where people can feel a part of if they do leave.
And the question, more of the detail, I'm not sure if it's relevant, but I'll ask it anyways. Does QAnon have an opinion on the Israel-Palestine conflict?
It is very interesting. It's very, as I mentioned, it's very anti-Jewish. It's very anti-Israel. The irony being that even the Hebrew language channels are very anti-Israel. So I've been trying to figure out, maybe it's appealing to certain segments within the ultra Orthodox community that are actually anti-Zionist. And again, I think most people don't realize there are communities in Israel that are ultra Orthodox, like the Satmar, these ones with the, they've got the fur hats and the silk robe. They wear this, looks like a silk bathrobe. And they feel that Zionism is wrong because it jumped ahead of when God was going to deliver Israel to the Jews. And so that these political movements sort of sidetracked or hijacked this ideology, so that there are elements that are, even in Israel, anti-government. They don't serve in the military. They tend, if they vote, they tend not to vote for regular candidates. They might only vote for their own candidates. But it might be that the Hebrew language QAnon is trying to appeal to that community. And that community is also tends to be also anti-vaccine and anti-mask and very pro-Donald Trump. As far as the Arab-Israeli conflict is concerned, when I've watched the QAnon material, which I don't want to recommend to other people, it's not enjoyable and it's very traumatizing. The images are pretty awful. All of the Arab-Israeli conflict is in part controlled by the cabal. And so the Palestinian diaspora, so they're pro-Palestinian in terms of saying how horrible the refugee crisis is and the diaspora, and look at the Israelis killing Palestinian children. But then in the next breath, they're Islamophobic and anti-refugee, anti-immigrant. So what you have very often with a conspiracy is that it's not internally consistent and that you have very opposite things said from 1 minute to the next. And that is actually consistent for conspiracy theories being inconsistent. And this is where the Arab-Israeli conflict may even play a role.
Again, a more practical question. How do you deal with conspiracy theorists claiming that they know how the world is run and that everybody else is simply dumb sheep that are sleeping?
So first of all, what I've encouraged is we need to have the media not trying to curry favor with this community because it benefits them. So you have, for example, in the United States now, Fox News is illegal in parts of Europe and in the UK, which is not a bad thing. But here we don't just have Fox News, we have Fox News, and then we have multiple groups like Sinclair Media and OAN to the right of Newsmax to the right of Fox News. I think that the news media needs to be more accurate and be less partisan. That I don't know if that's going to be fixed anytime soon. I think if you start having, and there has been preliminary discussions that the families of people who died of COVID-19 want to sue Fox News for spreading disinformation. This is how the KKK was pretty much brought down in the 70s and 80s, was through litigation. It's the fact that Charlottesville has been sued successfully, and they are now they've been found guilty in court. They're going to have to pay out millions of dollars, the alt-right groups that participated in 2017. I think that, unfortunately, until you have a media that isn't trying to cater news to a partisan group, then you have this possibility of having more conspiracy theories continue to proliferate. The other thing that we need to do is the political parties, despite the fact that they might be benefiting from the votes, they really need to be more responsible. We're starting to see some preliminary schisms in the United States within the Republican Conservative Party that different groups are fighting each other. So Marjorie Taylor Greene is attacking Representative Mace. Dan Crenshaw is attacking the QAnon groups in Congress, even though they're all Republicans. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, these are all names that might mean nothing to most people in Austria or in Europe, but in America, these are prominent Republicans who are attacking QAnon. So until we get some sort of impact where either QAnon isn't able to fund. So for example, when Marjorie Taylor Greene said that wearing the mask was like wearing a yellow star in World War II, or that Jewish space lasers were responsible for California wildfires, the GOP got a lot of pushback from Jewish donors to say, what are you doing? So I think that only once it starts having an impact, either financially or in their ability to be reelected, political parties are going to see the individuals that believe in conspiracy theories as useful idiots. And I don't know if the AfD is doing the same thing in Germany, but we are seeing right-wing populist movements emerge throughout Europe, and they're benefiting from these feelings of Islamophobia and anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic feeling. And so, we might have to, in Europe, because you have different kinds of laws, we might need to reinvigorate some of these like anti-Nazi, like you're not allowed. This is what's so surprising, that, the QAnon in Germany was spreading Nazi propaganda, which technically is illegal. So, if it is illegal, if the law needs to be enforced, we need to see more enforcement. And then there's this balance, right, between the freedom of speech and the protection of minorities and individuals. And we haven't reached the perfect balance yet. Like the equilibrium is still, we're still trying to figure it out. I personally blame a lot on social media. I think that the underlying motive for social media to make money is one of the reasons why they have no incentive to clamp down on racist groups or anti-vaccine groups. And I very often, find myself in this loggerheads where I'm part of the GIFCT, which is the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which was originally started by the big Silicon Valley companies. But then the Silicon Valley companies don't want to take responsibility for what they've done. So it really is a tension that I'm trying to work within by working in the system, but I'm very frustrated by the lack of engagement that the companies who have financially made billions of dollars are not willing to cut into their profit, because the companies have shareholders, and Zuckerberg is making billions of dollars, every few weeks he's increasing his net worth. There's no incentive for him to say, okay, we're going to clean the platform and get rid of all of this dangerous material. And so this is where, again, government regulation might come in. I don't know if Facebook in Germany and in Austria is as pernicious as Facebook is in America, but we are seeing some problems, and the problems don't go away.
And also, I guess part of the question was, but that's again also something that is really typical for QAnon only. We see it also with other kinds of extremist movements as well. Basically, when the person comes to you and has the impression that they have a superior knowledge or a secret knowledge that you don't have because you haven't read these materials, and how do you address that? I mean, do you try to deconstruct it, or do you say, okay, here's this other material, read this, and then come back?
Well, one of the things, Sophia, because Sophia is a psychologist, and one of the things that Dr. Moskalenko did in the book, so in the last chapter of the book, we have a series of questions and we have the answers. So we give you the questions. So basically, engage the individual. Oh, so I know how it works. Okay, tell me how it works. Now I'm going to ask you these series of questions. You're going to get to the point where they're unable to answer the questions, but you have the answer. And so we did something that in all of the books that I've written, the QAnon book is the 5th book I've published and the 6th book I've written, because my new book is in production. I've never had a section with like frequently asked questions. We call them FAQs, partly because they had the letter Q, but to be able to engage with people and then say, okay, so explain, what's the connection with this, or why is this happening, or why is that happening? And that as you're engaging the person, they themselves will realize, okay, I've just said the opposite. To answer this question, I've just said the opposite than the answer to that question. And that is one of the ways that you start to plant the seed of doubt and encourage its growth. But no, you can't, like when the person thinks that they have secret knowledge, the other thing that happens is that, it has this physiological effect on the brain of dopamine hits, that people feel like, oh, I'm so clever and I'm the only one that sees it. And so you can't say, no, you're an idiot, because that's going to have the opposite effect. You're like, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more. And as you're asking questions, the person will realize, oh, I don't have all the answers. And maybe they'll be more open to engaging new material that is disconfirming.
I guess we have 5 minutes left. If anyone else wants to ask a question, please go ahead. And there it is. Isn't there a point when reason does not work anymore, when the person you're talking to simply says, but it is like that?
There is, and part of it is that our argument is that it's not going to be at the end of the conversation, you won. Because even if you win temporarily, the person will come back to you 3 days later. No, I thought of something else. It's more about this very slow process of planting the seeds of doubt and then helping nurture those seeds of doubt to come to full fruition. Because if you get into an altercation where the person gets defensive and then just ends with, well, that's just how it is, then you haven't gone about this process the way we recommend it. What it is to say, well, that's really interesting. I'll think about this more. And the person goes, maybe they'll think about this more. And that's the seed of doubt, because you're not going to argue someone out of QAnon. What most you can hope for is to start getting them on the path of doubt to allow them that off ramp to leave. So this is where, like, you've seen this even people arguing with jihadis to say, well, they'll Surat at-Tawbah 5, kill them wherever you find them. And people will say, well, why are you starting from Surat at-Tawbah 5 instead of starting from Surat at-Tawbah 1? Like, why would you start verse 5 in any chapter of a religious text instead of starting from the beginning? And by the way, who are these mushrikeen? Oh, the mushrikeen are, Christians and Jews. No, actually, if you start from verse 1, you see the mushrikeen are a tribe in Arabia. And the person's not going to be like, okay, yeah, you're right. The person is probably going to walk away and go, I need to figure out who the mushrikeen are. And this is actually the narrative. This is actually a true story that Mubin Sheikh talks about. His own personal path out of jihadism was about Surat at-Tawbah 5. But he had a sheikh who was knowledgeable to say, okay, let's go back to Surat at-Tawbah 1 and start from the beginning. Who are we talking about? And then as they saw that it was a tribe in Arabia, and Mubin was able to look more into researching what is this tribe in Arabia to find out, no, in fact, the mushrikeen are not Jews and Christians, that you're supposed to fight them and kill them wherever you find them. So this is where, it's never going to be an argument that you win. It's going to be a persuasion that you begin.
These are very nice words, almost a nice ending. I just have one really short thing that I really wanted to ask you, because, dealing with other kinds of theories, because obviously in other kinds of extremism, there are also conspiracy theory or more usually. But this one, what could really label as outrageous? I mean, right? I mean, you can, and in that context, how, on a psychological level, how do they manage to convince people of something that really sounds unreal?
Because they start from something real. Right. They start from a position, and this is, for me, was so interesting. When I was writing, Veiled Threats is in production, and it's supposed to come out in 2022. By the way, I delivered the manuscript in 2019, but let's not talk about publishing during the pandemic. One of the things that ISIS recruited young girls, the Bethnal Green Academy girls in London, was, did you want to help the orphans? And of course, what person doesn't want to help orphans, especially women? And, with QAnon, did you want to save the children? A lot of the appeals start from a position of altruism and goodness, not from a position of, oh, I hate the Jews, so I'm going to believe in QAnon. Like, it doesn't start from there. It usually starts from something that is both legitimate and makes sense. And then it pulls you in. And I think that also, we don't know exactly if trauma leads someone to QAnon, or if consuming the material of QAnon creates a trauma. Because I can tell you that the work is very, like, when you're consuming this on their platforms, because I've had to do it, it's very triggering, it's very upsetting, it's nightmarish what you're seeing. And so what will happen is, eventually you are creating the vulnerability from a vulnerability. And I think it's important that if we think that most people got involved in QAnon because they thought they were helping, and not because they're evil, stupid people, will be more successful in helping them get out, because they won't perceive us being antagonistic.
Yeah, it's a good way to start. And thank you so much for this amazing talk. Thank you to the participants for taking part. December is a very busy month. Everybody needs to finish up whatever it is they're doing. So I'm really grateful for participants and for their questions. And of course, especially to Mia for finding the time to talk to us about this really relevant phenomenon, which will probably keep us busy for the next years.
And I'm very grateful to the Austrian Institute for International Affairs and for everyone who took the time to spend, an hour and a half with me and with us today. Thank you so much. And happy Christmas.
Everybody keep safe and see you soon.
Auf Wiedersehen. Bye.